In the winter of 1917, as snow slowly covered the silent streets of a small European town, Elias returns from the front not as a hero, but as a man carrying a history no one around him can see. And he walks past the same buildings he left 3 years earlier, noticing how everything looks unchanged while he himself feels fundamentally altered. And this contrast unsettles him more than the war ever did, because on the battlefield he understood his role. His purpose was clear: survive and protect the man beside you. But here, in peace, his identity dissolves into uncertainty, and as he enters his family home, he senses the weight of expectations, the unspoken hope that he will simply resume his old life, sit at the same table, take the same job, speak the same words. Yet internally, he knows that version of himself no longer exists. And as days pass, Elias becomes increasingly aware of how history is not only written in dates and victories, but in silent psychological shifts, in the way trauma reshapes perception, memory, and belonging. And he realizes that the true conflict is not between nations, but between who he was and who he has become. And this internal war feels more complex than any battle, because it cannot be escaped, won, or explained. And as he walks through the town cemetery, reading names of friends who never returned, he understands that survival itself is a burden, a responsibility to remember, to live in a world built on absence. And in this awareness, Elias begins to see history not as something that happened in the past, but as something that continues to unfold inside every person who carries its consequences, quietly shaping their choices, relationships, and sense of self long after the cannons fall silent. As spring arrives, Elias is asked to speak at a small-town gathering to honor the fallen, and he stands before familiar faces that now feel strangely distant, because their understanding of the war is built from letters, rumors, and official speeches, while his is constructed from fear, zapach porochu, and the constant awareness of mortality. And as he begins to speak, he notices how language fails to capture experience, how words flatten reality into something acceptable, something safe, and he feels an internal conflict between the desire to protect others from the truth and the need to honor those who lived and died within it. And this conflict reveals to him how societies rewrite trauma into narratives of pride and sacrifice, while individuals carry its unresolved weight in silence. And as he looks into the eyes of grieving parents, he realizes that no speech can heal absence, no ceremony can restore what history has taken. And yet he also senses that remembrance itself is a fragile form of resistance against forgetting, against turning suffering into abstraction. And in this realization, Elias understands that his role is not to glorify the past, but to bear witness to it, to exist as a living archive of experiences that will never fully be understood, but must never be erased. That night, Elias cannot sleep, and he lies awake listening to the quiet rhythm of the town, the distant sound of a train, the wind moving through bare branches, ordinary noises that now feel unreal compared to the constant explosions and shouted commands that once filled his senses. And he becomes acutely aware of how silence itself has become overwhelming, because in silence there is space for memory, and memory arrives without permission, replaying fragmented images of faces, screams, mud, cold, and the moment when he realized that survival is often random rather than deserved. And this thought troubles him deeply because it challenges the moral structure he was taught to believe in, the idea that bravery is rewarded, that good actions lead to good outcomes. And now he sees how history operates through chaos rather than justice. And this realization creates a profound internal dissonance because he wants to believe his suffering had meaning, that the deaths of his friends served a purpose beyond statistics and borders. Yet emotionally, he cannot reconcile this with the randomness of loss. And as he stares at the ceiling, he reflects on how war does not end when the fighting stops. It simply changes location, moving from the battlefield into the mind, where it reshapes time, emotion, and identity. and he recognizes that the person who left for the front expected to return to life, but the person who returned must learn how to live again from the beginning, without clear instructions, without shared language for trauma, without social structures capable of absorbing psychological reality. And in this awareness, Elias begins to understand that his true struggle is not to forget the past, but to integrate it, to allow memory to exist without letting it consume his present. And this task feels heavier than any physical burden he carried during the war, because it requires confronting uncertainty, guilt, and emotional fragmentation without the clarity of an external enemy. And as exhausting finally overtakes him, he senses that history has not released him. It has simply shifted its form, becoming an invisible presence that he must now negotiate with every day of his life.
In the following weeks, Elias attempts to return to work at the local factory, believing that routine might restore a sense of normality. But he quickly discovers that repetition without meaning feels empty, almost mechanical. And as he stands among machines and familiar faces, he feels disconnected, as if observing his own life from a distance. And this detachment unsettles him, because it suggests that normality is not something one simply resumes. It must be rebuilt internally. And he becomes aware of how the rhythm of civilian life feels fragile compared to the extreme intensity of war, how small inconveniences now provoke disproportionate emotional responses, irritation, numbness, sudden sadness. And he realizes that his nervous system is still calibrated for survival rather than stability. And this insight leads him to reflect on how societies expect veterans to reintegrate quickly, to function efficiently, to be grateful for peace, without acknowledging that peace requires a different psychological skill set than conflict. And as he observes his coworkers discussing trivial concerns, he feels both alienated and envious, because their worries represent a form of innocence he no longer possesses. And this loss of innocence feels irreversible, not tragic in a dramatic sense, but quietly devastating, because it alters the way he perceives reality itself, making him more aware of fragility, unpredictability, and impermanence. And in this awareness, Elias understands that healing is not about returning to who he was, but about constructing a new identity that can hold both memory and presence without collapsing under their weight. One afternoon, Elias visits the local school where he is invited to speak to children about the war, and he stands in front of young faces filled with curiosity and idealism, and he feels an unexpected resistance inside himself, because he does not want to transfer his emotional burden onto minds that still see the world as coherent and meaningful. And as he begins to speak, he chooses his words carefully, describing not battles or victories, but the importance of empathy, responsibility, and the value of human life. And he notices how the children listen not to the content of his story, but to the tone of his voice, the pauses between sentences, the subtle tension that reveals more than any description ever could. And in that moment, he realizes that trauma communicates itself indirectly through emotional presence rather than narrative detail. And this awareness leads him to reflect on how history is often taught through simplified frameworks of heroes and enemies, while real experience exists in ambiguity, fear, and moral uncertainty. And as he answers their innocent questions, he senses a strange emotional exchange taking place, where his own pain becomes softer in the presence of their curiosity, not erased, but transformed into something more constructive. And he understands that sharing experience does not require reliving it. It requires translating suffering into understanding. And this translation feels like the first genuine step toward healing, because it allows memory to serve connection rather than isolation. That night, after returning home from the school, Elias sits alone by the small oil lamp in his room, the light flickering softly against the walls, and he feels an unfamiliar emotional heaviness, not the sharp anxiety of memory, but a slower, deeper weight,
as if years of suppressed thoughts are finally demanding space. And he realizes that for the first time since the war ended, he is not trying to distract himself with activity or routine. He's simply sitting with his own внутренний свет, and this feels both frightening and necessary, because in stillness there is no external enemy, no command to follow, no structure to rely on, only the raw presence of his own thoughts. And he begins to reflect on how much of his identity was built around endurance, around surviving rather than living, and how this survival mindset shaped his emotions, making him cautious with joy, suspicious of hope, uncomfortable with long-term plans, because the future once felt like something that could disappear at any moment. And now, in peace, he must learn a completely different relationship with time, one where tomorrow is not a threat but a possibility. And this adjustment feels more complex than any physical injury because it requires emotional retraining, a slow reprogramming of fear into trust, of alertness into presence. And he recognizes that history does not only leave visible ruins, it leaves invisible patterns inside the human mind, patterns that continue to influence behavior long after the original danger has passed. And in this awareness, Elias understands that his true task is not to forget what happened, but to reinterpret it, to allow the past to exist as memory rather than destiny. And this realization brings a quiet emotional release, not dramatic, not cathartic, but subtle, a sense that healing is not a single moment of relief, but a long process of learning how to inhabit peace without feeling guilty for surviving it. In the days that follow, Elias begins to notice small changes in himself that he cannot fully explain, subtle shifts in the way he reacts to ordinary situations, like how he no longer startles at sudden noises as intensely, or how he can sit in a crowded room without feeling the constant need to scan faces for danger. And these changes feel insignificant on the surface, yet emotionally they represent a profound internal movement, because they signal that his nervous system is slowly learning a new reality, one where survival is no longer the primary objective. And he reflects on how deeply war trained his body and mind to expect loss, unpredictability, and threat, and how this training did not disappear with peace, it simply became less visible. And now, as he consciously allows himself to remain in moments of safety without anticipating catastrophe, he feels a strange resistance inside, almost guilt, as if calm itself is something undeserved. And this feeling forces him to confront an uncomfortable truth, that part of him still believes suffering gives life meaning, that struggle justifies existence, and without struggle he feels undefined. And this belief unsettles him more than any memory because it suggests that healing requires not only letting go of pain, but also redefining identity, moving from being someone shaped by endurance into someone shaped by presence. And this transformation feels slow, fragile, uncertain, because it lacks clear milestones. No medals, no recognition, no external confirmation, only internal shifts that must be noticed and validated from within. And in this awareness, Elias begins to understand that the most difficult part of history is not surviving it, but learning how to live without it once it is over. Because peace demands a different kind of courage, the courage to exist without crisis, without constant meaning imposed by danger, and to accept that a quiet life, though less dramatic, is no less real or valuable. One evening, Elias attends a small memorial service at the edge of town, not because he feels obligated, but because he senses a quiet need to confront something he has avoided. And as he stands among others holding candles, he notices how collective silence feels different from personal silence, how shared grief creates a sense of connection that private memory never could. And he listens to names being read aloud, some familiar, some forgotten. And with each name, he feels a subtle emotional release, as if acknowledging these lives publicly allows his own memories to settle into a larger context, rather than remaining isolated fragments of pain. And he realizes that mourning is not only about loss, but about integration, about placing personal experience within a collective narrative that validates suffering without glorifying it. And this realization changes his relationship with memory because he no longer feels solely responsible for carrying the past alone. He can share it, allow it to exist beyond his internal world. And in this shared space, he feels less burdened by survivor's guilt, less trapped by the sense that he must constantly justify his existence through endurance. And as the candles slowly burn down, he becomes aware of how rituals do not erase pain, but they transform it into something more bearable, more meaningful, because they allow individuals to participate in a process of remembrance that connects rather than isolates. And in this awareness, Elias understands that history is not only written by those who lived through it, but by how societies choose to remember, acknowledge, and learn from it. And this understanding offers him a new sense of belonging, not as a hero or victim, but as part of a shared human story that continues beyond individual suffering.
As Elias walks home from the memorial, the night air feels lighter than usual. Not because his memories have disappeared, but because they no longer feel trapped inside him. And he becomes aware of how his relationship with the past has subtly transformed, from something he carried as a private burden into something he can now hold as part of a larger human experience. And this shift brings an unexpected emotional clarity, because he realizes that healing is not about erasing history or redefining it into something beautiful, but about allowing it to exist honestly, without fear, denial, or constant resistance. And he reflects on how much of his life after the war was spent trying to return to a version of himself that no longer existed, believing that normality meant restoration, when in reality it requires reinvention. And this understanding softens his self-judgment, allowing him to accept his emotional changes not as damage, but as adaptation, as evidence of survival and growth rather than weakness. And he senses that peace is not a destination he reaches after enough time has passed, but a continuous internal practice, a way of relating to memory, emotion, and identity with patience and compassion. And as he enters his home, he no longer feels the same sense of alienation that once dominated his evenings. Instead, he feels a quiet readiness to inhabit his present life fully, without constantly measuring it against the past. And in this readiness, Elias experiences a profound internal alignment, an understanding that history will always remain part of him, but it no longer defines his entire existence. And this realization does not promise happiness or certainty, but it offers something more durable, the ability to live with memory without being controlled by it, and to move forward not in denial of what was lost, but in honest acceptance of what remains.